If everyone could take a seat, we'll go ahead and get started. Maybe. Yeah. So I just have a few announcements first thing this morning. As I mentioned yesterday, there are surveys located in your conference folder. If by chance you don't have your conference folder or you've lost the survey, that's no problem. We have students who have extras that they can hand out to you. They'll just kind of pass them through the rows. You can put those in the basket on the registration desk when you're finished with them. And also if you don't wish to keep your name tag, then you can return it to the basket on the registration desk also. As I said yesterday, the Global Gateway will offer a tour of the building this afternoon at 12:30, so you'll just meet in lobby right by the registration desk. Father Hall has also offered to lead a tour of St. Peter's this afternoon, and you'll meet at the Mercure lobby right across from San Clemente, where you were this morning, at 2 p.m. And you're going to take a bus, or is that the... Okay, take a city bus to St. Peter's. And if you need any information regarding your departure or transfer times, any pickups to the airport, Lindsay Switzer is at the desk until 11 a.m. this morning. So not very, yeah. And she, I think, handed out pieces of paper that have your flight information and departure times on there. If you are staying at the Mercure, you're welcome to print your boarding passes in their computer area that they have in the bar, or else you can ask me or any of the staff here for access to the printer here, and I'm more than willing to print it for you. The CME certificates will be available at the registration desk for you to pick up after this session, or else if you don't wish to pick it up now, we can mail it to you. And now I'll turn the microphone over to Ryan Madison, who will introduce this morning's speaker.
Good morning, and welcome to our final session of this conference. It promises to be very engaging and very exciting. We have for you Gilbert Meilaender. Gil is the Richard and Phyllis Duesenberg Chair in Theological Ethics at Valparaiso University and the Paul Ramsey Fellow at the Center for Ethics and Culture. One of the nation's preeminent bioethicists, Professor Meilaender has written extensively on the body, human identity, and the meaning of emerging technologies. He received his PhD from Princeton University, and before coming to Valparaiso in 1996, taught at the University of Virginia and at Oberlin College. He has served on the editorial board and as an associate editor of the Journal of Religious Ethics, as an associate editor for Religious Studies Review, on the editorial board of the Annual of the Society of Christian Ethics, and on the editorial advisory board of First Things. His books include Should We Live Forever? The Ethical Ambiguities of Aging, Bioethics, A Primer for Christians, and Body, Soul, and Bioethics. Professor Meilaender is a fellow of the Hastings Center and was a member of the President's Council on Bioethics from 2002 to 2008. This morning, Gil will be presenting a lecture entitled Making Children, Thinking about the Turn to Assisted Reproduction. Please join me in welcoming Gil.
Thank you, Ryan, very much. I'm pleased to be here. They don't have the information up there any longer that they've had every day. But that's okay, because I have no financial holdings that would constitute a conflict of interest. That's what the great disappointment of my life, actually. And it's sort of bothered me that session after session I've been reminded of that fact here. But I am pleased to be here. The first thing I need to say, though, is we should ask ourselves, why is this talk different from all other talks? Answer: no PowerPoint. So you may look at those screens as long as you want, but nothing is going to change on them. With me, you get only words. I hope to go to my grave without ever having given a talk with PowerPoint, and I think I'm well on the way to accomplishing that. Let me just say at the outset, in terms of where I'm ultimately headed, that The last part of this talk is going to be a little strange, different even by my standards, because I want to try to think about how we ought to think about the whole turn toward assisted reproduction. And as I'll say, the way we've generally thought about it, though it seems to me to be a persuasive way in some ways, doesn't necessarily persuade a lot of other people. And I'm going to sort of ask whether Christians need to look for a different way to think about this issue. And in the last part of the talk, after having kind of worked through some things that will be fairly standard, I think, with respect to it, I'm going to turn to try to develop a somewhat different way. And I hope that in your small groups whatever else you talk about, and you'll talk about obviously whatever you feel like talking about, but I hope that you'll ask yourself kind of how exactly should we talk about this, not just to the public at large, but among ourselves, and that's sort of where I'm headed. I begin though with just a bit of high culture. In Milton's Paradise Lost, Adam, after his fall into sin, raises an objection to God. And Adam says, "Did I request thee, Maker, from my clay to mold me man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me?" Interestingly, by the way, those words are the epigraph to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. But I quote the Milton passage, asking whether saying that he didn't ask God to promote him into existence. I quote it in order to note that we do not ordinarily or traditionally think of ourselves as bringing children into existence quite in the way God produces Adam. We don't just promote them into existence in that godlike sort of way. We engage in another activity, giving ourselves sexually, and lo and behold, sometimes a child results as the fruit and the blessing of that. But a revolution in reproduction has taken place in the last half century or so that enables us to act in a rather more godlike manner in producing children, and that's sort of what we need to think about. We tend to think of this as a technological revolution, and of course it is a technological revolution, but it is also, and perhaps more importantly, or at least as importantly, a revolution in our way of thinking about what we're doing, about what it means to be a parent or a child, and that's what I'd like to think with you about this morning. We can begin by just reminding ourselves how far-reaching the commitment to assisted reproduction has become and may soon become even more far-reaching. It was about 40 years ago in a book that was titled The Ethics of Genetic Control that Joseph Fletcher described predicted what he expected baby making to look like in the future. And Fletcher wrote about 40 years ago, "Lovemaking and baby making have been divorced. Sex is free from the contingencies and complications of reproduction, and sexual practice can now proceed on its own merits as an independent value in life." Now, at the time Fletcher wrote that, his description maybe just slightly outran the facts on the ground at that time, but we are now certainly approaching a point at which his predictions look pretty standard in some ways. And one question this raises, a question that I'm not taking up this morning, but Fletcher realized that it was involved, is what this fast-arriving future means for the nature of sexual experience, how it will affect that. The other question, the one I am thinking about and want to try to work through, is what this revolution means for baby making. We have accustomed ourselves to thinking about assisted reproduction primarily as an aid for infertile couples. That's certainly the way it mainly started. And when we focus on that, whatever our reservations may be about IVF, for instance, it's still true that if our focus is just on infertile couples, a certain kind of sympathy for those having recourse to it is almost inevitable. suffering sorrow because of their infertility. They want to have a child of their own, and they turn finally to this. But we're at a point now where we should take seriously the possibility that the reproduction revolution is much more far-reaching than that. And it's not just an aid to infertile couples. That aid may be problematic in a lot of ways too, but it's not just that. In a recent article last September in the New York Review of Books, scientist Carl Gerasi, who was one of the first developers of the birth control pill, and who actually has died in the 6 months or so since that article was written. He wrote that we're likely to see, in his terms, an increasing divorce of coitus from reproduction. And he had in mind something much more far-reaching than simply aid to infertile couples. Gerasi predicted that as it becomes easier to freeze not only embryos but also a woman's eggs, IVF will no longer be used only by those who have impaired fertility. Instead, it will become a useful and desirable reproductive method for women who experience no fertility problems at all. And as if on cue then, the New York Times reported a month later in October that some companies in America, and particularly tech companies, Facebook and Apple, have recently begun to offer as what they call a new health benefit, coverage of a considerable portion of the expense of freezing eggs for women who work for the company. It's part of their health insurance plan. And he also noted that women may even wish to be sterilized once their eggs have been retrieved, the better than to enjoy sex without the fear of an inconvenient pregnancy. Now, those possibilities are attractive to people, in part as a kind of insurance against any future health or reproductive problems. They're attractive for reasons that I think it's fair to call eugenic, that is, to produce children of one's own, but children free of certain problematic defects, children of a particular sex, perhaps, and so forth. They're attractive because they allow us to be in control of our lives, not to have our lives interrupted. There's nothing more interrupting in some ways than a child on many occasions. So it becomes increasingly clear that we now have to think about what it means to be a parent in this world in which we're now living, how we ought to think about that in a world in which it's possible for us to promote children into existence in sort of godlike fashion, produce a product. It's not just a kind of happy blessing that follows upon sexual relations, but is in fact a project that we undertake. And what's clear is that we have two different ways, a sort of traditional way and a more recent way of thinking about what it means to be a parent. One that I will simply describe as grounded more in nature, and the other grounded more in will. None of these distinctions work quite perfectly. It's one of the reasons that I think we need to look for new ways to think about it, since after all, part of our nature is to be willing, choosing beings. We don't just accept whatever comes along without controlling it. I'm happy every time I go to the dentist that somebody came up with Novocaine and didn't just say, well, it's one of the givens of our nature that you must suffer in the dentist chair. So I mean, the distinction isn't perfect, and it doesn't. If you start to press on it, it may be problematic in some ways, but still, it gets at something that is significant. So on the one hand, we have what is a rather traditional way of thinking, that being a parent means understanding sexual intercourse as naturally ordered toward procreation. Doesn't mean that it always results in a child, but it's naturally ordered toward that. The child is not thought of as willed into existence the way Milton's Adam is willed into existence by God, but rather the child is the outcome, or maybe even better, the manifestation or the unfolding of the embrace of love between a man and a woman. That's a kind of traditional way of thinking about what procreation involves. The other way of thinking, increasingly common, and if somebody like Fletcher 40 years ago or Gerasi 6 months ago is right, perhaps the wave of the future, this other way is grounded more in will and choice. To be a parent is to commission a reproductive project. That's what it means to be a parent. And in that reproductive project aimed at producing a child, the commissioners may need the help of various collaborators who are not in quite the same sense parents, but doctors, gamete donors, gestational surrogates, and so forth. And because this second understanding is not grounded in any notion of natural purposes of an order within nature, but grounded rather in our choices and what we will to produce. Because that's true, we may not be so certain what obligations it produces in us. Whatever the obligations are probably going to finally be determined by contract and consent and so forth when we figure out what the obligations of the various parties commissioned to participate in this project may be. Now, this turn to will and choice, the reproduction revolution, as I called it, has in a large degree been driven by the desire to have a child of one's own. And it's really that formula that I want to think about a little bit and eventually press on a bit. It's worth recalling a few examples of where this desire to have a child of one's own may lead. Let me just give you a few examples, all roughly adapted from real life. I'm not telling you anything you don't know here, but it's just worth reminding ourselves of the scope of what we're talking about. Here's the first example. An infertile couple sought IVF in hopes of producing a child of their own. We start with what is kind of the most sympathetic case in a way. Before undergoing the procedure, because you are entering into a world that's contractual in certain ways, the couple signed an agreement saying that the resulting embryos, whatever embryos they produced, could not be used without the consent of both parties, and that should they divorce, ownership of the embryos would in the future then be decided either in a property settlement or through a court decision. 9 attempts to implant embryos fertilized in the laboratory failed to produce a pregnancy that could be carried to term. 4 embryos were then implanted in a surrogate, the woman's older sister. None of those pregnancies succeeded either. Shortly thereafter, the couple divorced, maybe not surprisingly in a way, given the pressures involved in this. And the woman then sought a court order that would give her custody of the embryos so that she could continue the attempt to have a child of her own. It's a thirst that's very powerful there. Given the prior agreement the couple had made, the court ruled that she could not do that without the consent of her ex-husband, so the embryos were just kind of in limbo at that point. Different kind of case, a 63-year-old woman wanting a child of her own had implanted into her hormonally primed uterus an embryo that had been made in the laboratory from her husband's sperm and an ovum from a younger donor. She then completed the pregnancy and gave birth to a child that she at least wanted to describe as a child of her own. A woman unable to gestate a child of her own had her ovum fertilized with her husband's sperm in the laboratory. The embryo was then implanted in the womb of the woman's mother, who carried the pregnancy to term, giving birth, in some sense, to her grandchild. Quite recently, of course, as you've almost surely read, the UK has moved in the direction of approving the birth of what are at least colloquially called 3-parent embryos, so that in order to have a child of one's own, but a child free of mitochondrial disease, a woman's egg is removed, transplanted into an enucleated donor egg, which is then fertilized in the laboratory, and any child produced through this procedure would, in a certain sense, have 3 genetic progenitors, whatever exactly we want to call those progenitors, inheriting chromosomes from the man and the woman who commissioned the project, and then some mitochondrial DNA from the donor of the egg. But the parents, presumably, would be the commissioners of the project. That's what makes you a parent in this way of thinking, who wanted a healthy child of their own, not just a child who came along, but a child free of certain genetic defects. And then just last Saturday morning, before I left for the airport, when I was killing time waiting, it's a bone of contention with my wife. I'm always ready well ahead of time and expect everyone else to be ready well ahead of time. And then I'm killing time until I have to leave. But I saw the story of a 24-year-old gay man in Britain who desperately wanted a child of his own. I mean, that's exactly the way it was described, and he was described as desperately desiring this. He found an egg donor. He actually did some study to find one with the kind of traits that he thought were best in his case, and had the ovum fertilized with his own sperm, and his 46-year-old mother carried the child as a surrogate. And you just don't know how to describe. I've got to stop doing that. You just don't know how to describe the relationships at a certain point when that child is born. So this is not really just a technique to help couples who are infertile any longer. Indeed, it's not actually a technique for couples any longer. And the people who think in this way and who think of this as a project think of it as a right of individuals to get the child that they desire. We may be prone to think of reproduction as something that's involves a couple, but actually that's not the way we're thinking about it any longer. It's a right of individuals who will no doubt need other individuals to help in one way or another in the project, but that's the way we think of it. Now, when we consider these sort of possibilities, and you could multiply those cases, without end, really. When we think about them, it's a little astonishing to remind ourselves that the first test tube baby, as she was called, nobody would use that language any longer, was born just 35 years ago, in 1978. I mean, that's, in world historical terms, that's a blink of an eye. So that we have clearly begun to move from nature to choice. I already acknowledge that distinction isn't perfect, but we've clearly begun to move in that direction, teaching ourselves to think in very different ways about the relation between generations. And I do think that, at least in part, it's that the issue is not what we're able to do so much as the way we've trained ourselves to think. And so I want to say just a word first, reminding ourselves of the case for nature, for that traditional way of thinking, for a procreative relation in which the child isn't promoted into existence in godlike fashion, in which the child isn't made as a project, but is rather begotten. Not the product of our making, but of our doing. And I think that there have been at least two important reasons that we have used to try to explain the significance of that. The first is to point to the fact that human beings are not just free spirits, free self-transcending spirits. We are that in some ways, but we're also animals. We're bodies, and we need to know ourselves there as embodied creatures, located in a certain place, who occupy a fixed place in the generations of humankind. Lines of kinship and descent mark us and identify us. And unless we allow them to limit our freedom just to produce children as we please, we may in some ways alienate ourselves from our embodied condition. We may kind of lose something that's as essential to being human as that self-transcending freedom to remake nature in all sorts of ways. And so from that rather traditional perspective, to learn to affirm and give thanks for our place, our embodied place in those lines of kinship and descent, is to begin to learn how to give thanks for the mysterious gift of life and to acknowledge it as a gift. It's to accept and rejoice in the creaturely limits of life and to relinquish the thirst to be something more than a creature. That's one reason that I think has been underlying our commitment to a kind of traditional understanding of procreation. The other is that the sexual union of a man and a woman is, as I said before, naturally ordered toward the birth of children. That's just a natural fact, though. That's just sort of something about biology. But the idea has been that we may discern, if we have eyes to see, we may discern in that natural fact a lesson, a moral lesson to be learned. Something like this. The act of love is not just an act governed by the rational will. That's one place St. Augustine got it a little wrong. He really did think it was an act governed by the rational will. No, it's a passion. that comes over us. And we talk about lovers experiencing ecstasy, that is, say, standing outside oneself, stepping outside of all our plans and our projects and so forth. And when we do that, when a man and a woman give themselves to each other in that way, in the act of love, however much they may want a child, however much they may have decided, let's do it now because the odds are good that a child will result, in the act of love, they give themselves to each other. They're not engaged in any project other than one of self-giving in love to each other. And therefore, the child who results is not the result of my project, but is God's yes to that act of mutual self-giving that took place. And traditionally, we've thought of that as the ground, I think, of our reason for describing children as gifts and as blessings. That they're not our projects, but they're the blessing God gives when we give ourselves to each other. And because they're not our products that we have promoted into existence, they are our equals in dignity. We don't say what they're for. You see, they are one of us, equal to us in dignity, not eugenically shaped, not possessed as children of our own exactly, but as gifts and blessings that are given to us. So that an understanding of parenthood grounded more in nature than simply in our will and our choice and our projects is, I think, the one that is best suited to help us see children not as our own possessions, but as a kind of mysterious gift given to us as the fruit of love, which is, after all, if you think about it, why we hand those children over in baptism. When we bring them for baptism, what the rite of baptism says to us, if we actually pay attention, is this child is not your own. You hand the child over and bring it, and that turns me in the what I described at the start as the perhaps a little peculiar direction that I want to take, but. The argument that I just briefly worked through in terms of the 2 points about why we have thought that it's important to understand the sexual act as naturally ordered toward procreation, grounded in our embodiedness and in the sense that it means the child is a gift equal to us in dignity. I've tried that argument in various ways, a ton of times over the years. I think it's a good argument. It persuades me. I think it's unanswerable, probably. But you know what I've discovered is that there seem to be lots of smart people, just as smart as I am, who just don't seem to be persuaded by it. I will probably keep trying it for as long as I bother to talk about such things. But I'm not certain. I'm not certain how it's working. And I don't just mean that I'm not certain how it's working for some of the students I've taught. I mean, who knows what works for them, after all. I don't just mean that it's not working for the public at large. That maybe is not a big surprise in many respects. I mean that I don't have any great confidence that it will work for the person sitting in the pew next to me on Sunday morning. And so the question I have found myself thinking about, given the fact that it's actually not so easy to make the distinction between nature and will, since, as I said before, I mean, part of our nature is to be willing creatures who don't just acquiesce in the natural order of things. And given that those complications mean that a lot of reasonable people just don't seem to see the beauty of the argument that I've made on a number of occasions, I've found myself wondering whether, rather than treading that well-worn ground, we might find, at least for Christians, a third way, a different way of trying to think about the relation between parents and children that will come at it from a rather different angle and free ourselves from the course that the reproduction revolution has taken. And I want to try that on you. You'll tell me later if you think it's no good. That's okay. You wouldn't be the first person who told me that something I'd argue was no good. So that's fine. But I start with a sentence from Michael Banner. Banner's a well-known theological ethicist in Great Britain. And Banner has written fairly recently, "Christians do not believe in the desperateness of childlessness. And that, in a sense, is what I want to think about, okay? Christians do not believe in the desperateness of childlessness. This is important because it is that desperateness that has driven so much of what I've called, for shorthand, the reproduction revolution. Now, what does he mean? How can we make sense of this sentence? Well, think again about baptism, okay? Traditionally, and often still today, I think it's a practice that has fallen a little bit into disrepair, but traditionally the child to be baptized was given godparents for the child. Although the origins of the practice, historians seem, I'm not a historian, but historians seem to think the origins of the practice are unclear, and that it seems to have varied. The practice of godparenthood seems to have varied somewhat from place to place and time to time. We do know that by the early Middle Ages, at least in some places and at some times, there are a couple interesting things to note about how godparents work. The child was given godparents, and it was the godparents who presented the child for baptism. There's a little lingering bit of that still. I think often it's the godparents who actually carry the child to baptism still today. That's kind of a lingering vestige of this. But not too often today does it have the kind of implications that it had at some times and places then. Because not only did the godparents bring the child, present the child for baptism, but in some places the parents were expected or even required to be absent from the baptism when the godparents presented the child. And also in some places relatives were forbidden to be godparents. None of this kind of honorific passing around of godparenthood to one's relatives. Why? Well, because the whole point of the rite of baptism is that the child's natural kinship bonds are being relativized by a new spiritual kinship within the church. Something different is happening here. This does not mean that the natural kinship is of no significance. Indeed, it would be a complicated matter to try to work out the connections, but it does mean that that natural kinship is relativized and reconfigured in certain ways. St. Augustine, in one of his sermons, Sermon 51, if you'd like to go read it, it's a fairly long sermon by our standards today, I might warn you, probably about 30 pages, something like that. But Augustine emphasized to his congregation, in fact, in this sermon, that a man need not be a biological progenitor of his son to be that son's father, and his paradigmatic example to seal the case was, of course, Joseph. Okay, Jesus was not, to use the biblical language, born of Joseph's seed, but Joseph was, nevertheless, his father. Augustine says in the same sermon of Mary, it means more for Mary to have been a disciple of Christ than to have been the mother of Christ. Not sure how that goes here, but we Lutherans sort of think that sounds pretty good, actually. And there can be no doubt that spiritual kinship is what has the central place in the New Testament. Jesus says, "Do not think it's sufficient to have Abraham as your father." St. Paul says, "Flesh and blood will not inherit the kingdom." It's spiritual kinship that has the central place in the New Testament. And so perhaps, and they say this is just what I've begun to think, at any rate, perhaps when Christians try to articulate our concerns about IVF, or just about the assisted reproduction revolution more generally, we should not rest content with trying to make the case for nature as opposed to kind of will and contract. I wouldn't give that up. As I said, I will keep trying it. I've just discovered that smart people don't always see how obviously true that argument is. So that case is well worth continuing to make. But a problem with it is that in certain respects, the case from nature that I made almost accepts the premise that has driven so much of the reproduction revolution, namely that it's essential to have a child of one's own. And what I'm wondering is whether what we need is a frontal attack on that premise. And of course, then when people think that way and produce children in various ways, it sets us off on an absolutely fruitless search to figure out who from among these various progenitors we should call what, we should call parents or something like that. And as I pointed out with some of those cases, you just actually can't figure it out in certain instances at least. So that this is an important theological point that we need to think about. I'm going to return to it as a theological point in just a couple minutes at the conclusion of what I have to say. But before I return to it as a specifically theological point, I want to try to illustrate it to some way. This is, and this, I don't know whether you'll like the illustration or not. This is more what I like, at any rate, and it is my talk, after all. But I want to illustrate it not from high culture, but from sort of lower to the ground, with two children's stories. Okay, each of these is I think a good story, but they teach somewhat different lessons, and let me work them through for you. I should say, before I start in the first one, that in the first one in particular, the English word EGG is going to occur on a number of occasions. I will probably say egg, to my wife's dismay. I know that you probably think it should be egg, but if you come from certain places, you may say egg. And if I say that, it's not that I'm entirely ignorant, it's just that I say egg. At any rate, the first of the two stories is P.D. Eastman's little story, Are You My Mother? I'm just betting that a few people here at least have read this book to children, okay? In Are You My Mother, what I've called the claims of nature are given their due. And those claims have a certain due, okay? The story begins with a mother bird sitting on an egg in her nest. The egg jumps, and the mother realizes that her baby is going to be born very soon, and that the baby will then need to eat. And so she flies off in search of food. While she is gone, the baby bird hatches and finds himself all alone. And where is my mother? He asks. And then that simple question generates a search that basically gives the storyline of the book. And it's just a little picture book. Off the baby bird goes looking for his mother, even though he's not yet able to fly, so he does this on the ground. And he doesn't actually, of course, quite know what his mother looks like. And so he can't do anything more than ask those whom he meets by chance, Are you my mother? And we meet then with pictures, all the possible candidates, though the reader, of course, knows these are very unlikely candidates, but meets all these candidates on page after page. Kitten, hen, dog, cow, car, boat, plane. He asks the same question of all of them. None of them respond affirmatively, of course. And so this search continues. At last, the baby bird sees a big steam shovel. He asks the same question there, but he gets caught up in the huge shovel, lifted high in the air, and dropped back into the very nest from which he had at first set out. Just then, the mother bird comes back to the tree. Do you know who I am? She says to her baby, and of course somehow he does. You see, he knows that she's not a kitten, hen, dog, or any of those other possible candidates for motherhood that he's met along the way. And although actually, he and the mother bird have not really shared any time together since he hatched. They have no shared history since he hatched. The baby bird has found the right mother for himself, the mother who is naturally suited for him, and all is well at the end with mother and baby bird safely nestled together once again in their nest. And it's a nice, comforting, I guess, story. It's been a long time since I was a little child, but there's kind of comfort in that, I suppose, and that's the way the story ends. It's a good story. It's an engaging story. By my lights, at least, and especially in kind of the direction I'm trying to think about this question, not quite as good a story, however, as another, I think less well-known children's story. I don't know if anyone here would have read it, by Kiko Casa, if that's the correct pronunciation. The story is called A Mother for Choco. I don't know if anybody has ever read it or not. It's, in a certain sense, it's the same story, but just with a reverse kind of twist that is given to it. Choco is a little yellow bird with striped feet who lives alone. Lives alone, and he wishes he had a mother, but asks himself, who could his mother be? And so one day he sets off on a search to try to find his mother. So we got the whole search motif again, just as in the other story, and it's roughly the same kind of thing. Choco meets a giraffe, but lacking wings. The giraffe says she can't be his mother. He has wings. The giraffe doesn't. He meets a penguin who does have wings, but does not have the big round cheeks like Choco has, so she can't possibly be the mother. He meets a walrus. She has the needed round cheeks, but lacks the striped feet that he has. And there are still other animals: an elephant, a turtle, a rabbit that get pictured. But no matter where he turns, he can't find a mother who looks just like him. And then Choco meets Mrs. Bear picking apples. He's pretty sure she can't be his mother, for she looks nothing at all like him. And he starts to cry, and Mrs. Bear comes running to him and to comfort him, asks him what's wrong. And it says that as she listened to Choco's story, she sighed, "Oh dear, if you had a mommy, what would she do?" Well, Choco says, "She would hold me." And Mrs. Bear hugs him tight. "She would kiss me," Choco says. "Like this?" asks Mrs. Bear, and she gives him a great big kiss. "She would sing and dance with me," Choco says. And Mrs. Bear picks him up and sings and dances with him. Perhaps Mrs. Bear suggests she could be Choco's mother. But Choco says, "You aren't yellow, and you don't have wings or big round cheeks or striped feet like me." True enough, Mrs. Bear acknowledges, but nonetheless she takes Choco home with her, where an apple pie and her other children are waiting. Those other children who rush out to greet her turn out to be a hippopotamus, an alligator, and a pig. Okay? They all eat the pie, and they laugh and sing together. And then it says that after their delicious treat, Mrs. Bear gave all her children a big warm bear hug, and Choco was very happy that his new mommy looked just the way she did. Okay. Now, Mrs. Bear does not have a child of her own in the sense that we talk about it, in the sense that thirst has been driving the reproduction revolution, but she is a mother who has children. Not precisely as the result of will and choice. There was choosing involved. Not certainly, though, as the product of kind of nature and reproduction in the ordinary sense. It's not nature that's at work here. It's shared history that has produced this. And so I return to Michael Banner's statement: Christians do not believe in the desperateness of childlessness. What Christians believe in is what in the Pauline letters in the New Testament is described in the Greek word huiothesia. It's a word that's only used a few times. It's not used frequently in the New Testament, but it's actually central to what's going on there. Ryan looks like he's starting to move back there, but I'm almost done, Ryan. A literal translation of huiothesia would be adoption as a son, or to place as a son. And as I said, although the term occurs only a few times, it's a central concept in terms of what redemption, what becoming a member of the body of Christ, what parenthood and sonship actually mean. It's not a legal fiction that St. Paul has in mind when he uses the term. What the Holy Spirit's work of adoption does is give the place, the real place, the genuine place of a son to one to whom that place does not belong by nature. And that is, after all, the central understanding of what's going on in the New Testament, so that the adoptee's sonship is not assured by natural descent or characteristics or merit of any kind, but it's simply dependent on God's free grace. And in fact, even God's chosen people, Israel, according to St. Paul, not according to Israel, of course, but even God's chosen people is so not by nature, but by covenant, because in Romans 9, verse 4, Paul actually uses that Greek word huiothesia of Israel, that their status also is one of adoption. And so it's not as if Gentile Christians are incorporated into God's people on a basis different from that of Jewish believers. All receive the Spirit-given adoption as sons. We are one and all adoptees in terms of that New Testament understanding. So then when we think about the revolution taking place in reproduction, I think we need to make the case for nature. I've tried it too many times to think it's worthless. The case for children who are not made but are begotten, for children who are gifts and blessings, not products. That's an important case to continue to make, children who are equals in dignity and not ours to possess. But to make only that case and to focus on the biological bond that connects parents with children runs the risk, as I noted earlier, of accepting and maybe in some ways even reinforcing the premise that lies at the heart of the reproduction revolution, that we must have a child of our own and that is so essential. And so I think my notion, at least, is that Christians should also make another case, a case that I think lies, in fact, at the very heart of the New Testament, that childlessness is not finally tragic, and that fatherhood or motherhood in the end is not determined solely or primarily even by our genes. And knowing that, perhaps we can begin to become freed from the tyranny of some of our desires, including the desire to have a child of one's own. And there he is, Johnny on the spot. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gil. That was great. So 30 minutes again, you know the drill. 30 minutes for discussion groups. We'll come back here. 15 minutes or so of questions. And then we have our reception at noon. So. Okay, we're ready to take some questions.
Whenever there aren't questions, I just always assume it was such a wonderful presentation that, it was.
Well, I will start. You mentioned that you have a Lutheran background, and I'm a Catholic, and I would like to know, and Professor, I don't know that, but you may. How does the Humanae Vitae address this issue of nature and will that you brought up?
So I, a Lutheran, am to explicate Humanae Vitae in this crowd. I'm not. I have read Humanae Vitae on several occasions. I'm not sure that the kind of the way I was using the nature will distinction exactly structures it, but of course the argument that was the central reason for the encyclical being written, the argument that every act of sexual intercourse should remain open to the transmission of life, is an argument grounded in a certain sense of natural order, the purposes of the sexual act, and the sense that those purposes should not be frustrated, even though we might have a lot of reasons we would choose to frustrate them on various occasions. So I don't think, if I'm remembering correctly, that the argument proceeds in quite those sort of terms that I used, but it's clearly an argument that's grounded in nature in a certain sense of a natural order that is to be honored and affirmed and respected and not turned against. I think that's the nature of the argument. Subject to correction by, Yes.
I would like to speak on behalf of the Orthodox, if I may, even though I'm a Roman Catholic priest. So I'm looking forward to hearing their responses. Something that struck me in the nature, this is a theological issue, the nature you're speaking of adoption, it made me ask questions about differences among understandings of theological nature of adoption, with Christ, and how that relates to humanity, and it has bioethical implications. So my understanding, perhaps of the Orthodox view and some Roman Catholic views, is that God does choose us without our merit, so fully unmerited adoption. However, after he adopts a child, you take on divine nature. You retain your human nature, but it's somehow divinized. And so what that means is that you now bear a likeness to God that you didn't bear in the first place. And I would contrast that notion of adoption with another notion that might just say it's an adoption that's purely extrinsic. It's one that's chosen without merit, and the adoption always remains on that level of an extrinsic relationship. So the biomedical implications of that perhaps would mean that the notion of purely extrinsic adoption or one by will could somehow break down, because in the theological notion there's a relationship that is a continuing trajectory toward not entire identity, but a similitude or a likeness that is beyond what nature could fully afford.
So, having spoken, having explicated Humanae Vitae, I now should speak on behalf of the Orthodox. Well, yeah, we could just, I could just give the truth, and the Orthodox would have to decide whether they saw it or not. Rather than trying to answer that head on, which I'm probably not capable of doing, I do think that that notion of adoption in the New Testament, huiothesia, that St. Paul uses, that is how one becomes a son of God. We are created as children of God in a certain sense, but the sonship that adoption gives is something different, so that it's connected with, you can say, Abba Father, for instance, the passage in Galatians where he uses the term, so that we approach God as Father in Christ, as adoptees, not just as God's creatures in a way. And something different has happened there. And I don't know about the intrinsic, extrinsic language exactly. I worry about the extrinsic language because it seems to suggest something that's not fully a reality. And I mean, I don't know, if I may just talk for a minute, I'd tell you one of the ways that I got started thinking about this question, and it's got nothing to do with either Roman Catholicism or Orthodoxy. In Islam, as you know, for instance, a woman must veil herself in the presence of other men except for her father, her brothers, and if she marries, her husband. Islam has nothing against adoption. Indeed, they honor adoption, though it turns out that it's a little more like fostering, what we might call fostering, because if a young girl is adopted into a Muslim family, when she reaches puberty, she must begin to veil herself in the presence of her father and her brothers. She would not hug them or kiss them. Why? Because the relation continues to be extrinsic. She's not actually a blood relation. I don't think Christians would ever think that way. And I think it's got something to do with that concept of adoption in the New Testament. And that's what leads me to think that the extrinsic language can't be quite satisfactory to capture. Now, whether one has to therefore move to some sort of theosis, divinization notion, I don't know. I confess to never having understood exactly what the Orthodox had in mind there, but that relation of sonship that is taken up as something more than just a kind of external relation seems to me to be true there. Now, what that's got to do with the reproduction revolution, I can't say for sure, but that'd be the best I could do for an answer.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm back here. Thanks very much for a provocative talk. I guess I would want to suggest there needs to be a third movement So if I understood correctly, in the first movement, we thought about the traditional argument, and you thought that it might give over too much to the importance of my own child, and that seems right. There's a worry I have, though, about the second movement, which, of course, on its own terms is correct, the dignity of adoption and spiritual kinship. But you could have added, and this would lead to the worry of that story taken in isolation, right? You could have added a third well-known children's book, right, My Two Daddies, to the story, because the spiritual kinship one lends itself to, what would the revisionist theologians say? Let's not be too physicalist about our biology, which is, right, a strange sentence, but it's one you hear all the time. And or even, right, there might be a British version now, My Three Architects, and a fuzzy mitochondrial DNA character. So we need perhaps the third movement, which is to synthesize these two and show that they're not in conflict with each other, lest the second story, which is important, be seen to affirm too much of what has moved us in a different way toward this assisted reproduction.
I would like to comment on that briefly. It's an issue that came up in my small group also. And there is a sense, difficult to sort out finally, in which I want to affirm, I'll put it in your terms, that gratia non tollit naturam sed perficit. Grace does not destroy nature but perfects it, and that these two arguments, these two movements, must somehow fit together. They tend to fit together eschatologically for me, not here and now. But yes, there is a worry, and it's I suppose, a legitimate worry that to make the move I made opens the doors for all sorts of parent-child relations, same-sex parents, and so forth, is what you're worried about. What I want to say to that, this would, and I don't know whether I can work it out perfectly or not. I may not be able to, but this would take something sort of more complicated than we can manage here, is that we should not make arguments against same-sex marriage or against various forms of reproductive technology that use donor gametes and so forth. We should not construct our arguments, and I oppose all those things, okay? I mean, I've made a living of opposing such things. But we should not construct arguments against those things that turn out in the end to raise questions about the legitimacy of adoption, which is, as I said, central to Christian thinking. So, and there have been some arguments, even if you'll permit me to say some Roman Catholic arguments of late, that look to me as if they do that by the time you end up working through the necessity for a biological mother and father, it turns out that adoption drops out. I think we need to ask ourselves kind of what are the real arguments we want to make against various forms of assisted reproduction and same-sex marriage and same-sex parenthood and so forth, and find ways to make those arguments that do not prove more than we ought to be proving. So, I mean, it's a big job, but that, and I understand exactly why you make the move, raise the question you make, but we shouldn't use, we shouldn't construct arguments that just turn out to destroy central premises of Christian belief.
Talking earlier and then in our conversations in our small groups that there were some interesting connections or possible connections between this topic and Loris's discussion of concepts of health and treatment goals and those sorts of things. And I wonder if you could speak a bit to the extent to which having a robust sort of discussion about concepts of health and concepts of disease could also help inform this discussion, because it strikes me that much of reproductive medicine has now moved well beyond the realm of restoring and preserving health.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's a nice point. I'm actually, Loris gave a good talk, but I'm even a little, and he wanted to support a kind of understanding of health that moved a little bit beyond the really physiologically restricted definition to something a little larger than that, to let patients' goals in and so forth. And I understand that, and I think at some point it's impossible to avoid that entirely. But I am, on the whole, an advocate of a fairly non-expansive, restricted notion of health, precisely because it doesn't mean that those other factors are important. It just means that that's not what doctors do. They don't save us from all sorts of things. So that one of my worries, I often feel sometimes in certain groups that I'm the only religious person there who worries about those expansive notions of health. Religious folk, when you start to wholeness and so forth, all the religious juices start to flow, and we get on board. And pretty soon it turns out that we don't have any need for anything other than doctors, because they solve all the problems of human well-being. So I would like myself to keep our notion of medicine's task fairly restricted, and a rather modest notion of health as the kind of well-working of the organism and so forth, and leave some of those other things for the clergy and fellow Christians and so forth to deal with. Now, you can't make that won't work perfectly. I understand. It's always going to get expanded a little bit, but there's no end to that expansion. I mean, when that topic used to come up, we'd talk about facelifts or something like that. We're talking about things significant, much more significant than facelifts now. There's really no end to that once the expansion starts to take place. So I think it's a legitimate worry.
All right, one more question.
Some of the concern you expressed, and I heard other people express, was we're engaged here in a philosophical discussion, but the main concern at heart, in part, is what do you teach the lay people, and how are they informed on this? So I'd sort of like to bring that up. Since I'm a Lutheran, I'll ask you the Luthor question, which is, what does this mean?
That's from Luther's Small Catechism. Those of you not well instructed. Well, I do think it's. I mean, I don't know what it's like day to day in most Roman Catholic parishes. I have some sense of what it's like in a lot of Lutheran parishes. Chaotic, to be honest, and we simply don't know, haven't found out how to help people think about these matters, and the problem is that. Again, I said I don't know what it's like in Roman Catholic parishes, but it's entirely possible that I could walk into church on Sunday and that in the pew in front of me there could be a family that's produced a couple children through IVF. I mean, I won't necessarily even know that, but it's entirely possible. And once that happens often enough, it becomes very difficult for the church to find ways to teach about it. I mean, the example that well, you've got your own problems with divorce, but they're different problems. In the case of Lutheranism, where we have so often made our peace with it, if you get a gospel reading that you're supposed to preach on from one of the Gospels, where Jesus talks about divorce, clergy don't know how to preach on that because 40% of the people sitting out there might be divorced and remarried. And once you reach a certain point, you don't know how to instruct, teach, catechize, what to do, and that's where we are. But I do think that that an argument that actually starts from something as simple and central in the New Testament as adoption, and there's just central passages where Paul uses that language. Is in a certain way intelligible in a way that my really nice sort of philosophically worked out arguments may not. It's a taste for a more restricted group probably, but to really try to ask ourselves, what does this mean for our life together as Christians, seems to me to be a fruitful way to go. But I mean, Protestantism is a fragmented condition, and I don't know what exactly we can do about it, and I'll leave Roman Catholics to figure out what they can do. Carter will tell us.
We'll figure it out. Don't worry, Gil. Thank you, Meilaender. Thanks again to Gil. This brings us to the close of our Medical Ethics Conference, the 30th Annual Medical Ethics Conference. We're delighted that you all were able to join us. I'd like to thank some of the people who were absolutely indispensable in making this possible. Pamela Canavacci, who's the event coordinator here for the Global Gateway in Rome. Elizabeth Kuhn and Harriet Baldwin from Notre Dame in South Bend. Laura Nash, our own event planner here at the Center for Ethics and Culture. The entire staff of the Center for Ethics and Culture. Ted Catchy and the Global Gateway here in Rome. All of our Soren Fellows, and especially those that came to participate in this event, as well as the resource staff drawn from various parts of the country to lead our discussions, as well as all of our speakers. So thank you all for coming. We had a wonderful time here, and we look forward to seeing you next year back in South Bend. So we'll talk. Thank you very much. Travel safely.